When the Labour government was elected, the internet went wild. Their tabloids were loving it, landlords were hating it, and the British public was left confused. Nobody was sure what would happen to the economy or the property market and how this would affect everyday people. Now, although nobody can say for certain what the future holds, I've been in property for the past 18 years and I've seen crashes, booms, and everything in between. So today, I'm going to answer the internet's most asked questions about the housing crisis to help explain the situation. Okay, will the UK housing market crash in 2025? Well, look, no one can say for sure, but if you had to pin me down to a yes or no answer, I've got to say no. And actually, a crash to me seems less likely than it has done for a few years, which might sound weird for a couple of reasons. First of all, the longer it's been since the last crash, the closer you are to the next one. There's going to be a crash at some point. That's just how property prices work. They tend to drift upwards and then have a sudden crash and then drift upwards again. And over the long term, if you zoom out enough, you've got this upward trend, but it's got all this stuff in the middle. If you look at the things that could cause a property crash in 2025, there's a few things. So there could be like a major global event. You can't predict that. There could be something that damages the UK economy in particular and leads to widespread unemployment. There could be a sudden spike in interest rates because inflation gets out of control again. Or you could have the fact that interest rates have already gone up by so much. Everyone's dealt with it for this long, but then they suddenly can't anymore. And that affects the market. All of those are possible, but I wouldn't say that they were looking particularly likely. What you can't have as an argument for a crash is just prices are high. And it's true, prices are at or close to their all-time high, but that's not unusual. The price of everything is at an all-time high most of the time because of inflation. That's just how it works. Whereas if you look at property prices after correcting for inflation, we've already had a crash in that sense because over the last few years, the price of your groceries, the price of everything else, and hopefully your wages have gone up. But house prices haven't. They've been pretty much flat. So when you correct for that and look at house prices in what's called real terms, they're actually significantly lower than they were a few years ago. We've done a video in the past about this silent property crash, which I think is really important to understand. Generally speaking, before you get a crash, you have to have a boom where everyone's getting overexcited and paying silly money and you can't even get a viewing. Everything's going to sealed bids. The market is nowhere near that at the moment. That could change. You could get that mania and then a crash in 2025, but that seems unlikely to me. Okay, should I rent or buy a house in 2025? I mean, that is purely a you question. It's about your circumstances. I don't believe that when it comes to your own home, you should be looking at it primarily as an investment. And I don't think you should be trying to time the market. If you're buying a home, it should be because you want somewhere to live and you're going to be living there for at least 5 years, probably more like 10, because there are so many costs associated with buying it. If you've got the money and you've got the ability to get a mortgage, you have that degree of certainty that you'll want to stay there and there's somewhere that you want, then go for it. If not, then I wouldn't feel pressured to do it. People have this idea that you have to jump on the housing ladder as soon as you can because prices are just going to run away from you. But that generally tends not to be the case. There are times when property prices are going up way faster than everything else. But over recent years, they've lagged behind the price of everything else. They've gone up slower than inflation. At the moment, they're probably going up around about in line with inflation. So as long as your savings and your earnings are keeping up with inflation, then house prices aren't getting out of reach. I certainly understand why there's this pressure, and once you've bought, you locked in your price, you're good. So I totally see the appeal of doing that. But if you do that and then 2 years later, oh, actually, I want to move for work or I want to move in with my partner and so I have to sell it, then the costs of the buying and the selling are going to so much outweigh whatever gain you've had on your house. So it doesn't really work. Is there a London housing crisis? I don't like the word crisis in general. It seems like everything has to be a crisis and it kind of starts to lose its meaning. But housing in London is certainly not good. What happened in London is after the last crash, London prices, London rents bounced back really quickly. And they got to a point around 2016, 2017, where they were just crazy high. People were spending the majority of their wages on somewhere to rent. If you wanted to buy somewhere, the deposit you need would be outrageous. And it got to a point where prices just couldn't go up anymore. And since then, believe it or not, it has got better. London prices are more affordable than they were a few years ago, but still not affordable by any normal person's definition. And it's still really hard to find somewhere to rent. There's loads of competition, not really enough supply. So crisis or not, yeah, living in London is really hard. Okay, should rent prices be controlled? No, rent prices should not be controlled. And don't get me wrong, I can see the appeal. If the price of something is too high and it's causing people pain and real problems, then capping that price seems to make sense. Bring that price down if you can. The problem is it doesn't actually solve anything. It's not the case that all landlords get together in a dark room and plan what their rents are going to be and go, haha, we're all going to put our rents up this year. It doesn't work. There are tens of thousands of individuals in the market who can't work together. It's not landlords who set prices. It's the market that sets prices. If you're a landlord, you can test this by marketing your property at a rent that's too high. You will not get any calls. No one will be interested and you'll be forced to lower it again. So if you control rents and cap them or try and bring them down, that doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't create any more supply. All it means is price isn't being used as a mechanism to allocate the housing that there is. Instead, there'd be waiting lists, or it come down to who you know, who can get you in. There has to be some kind of mechanism if it's not price. Regulating rents doesn't create more supply. It actually reduces supply because no one wants to come into a market where you don't have control over whether you're allowed to make a profit or not. In fact, in Argentina, rent controls that had been in place were recently removed and rental prices fell in real terms because more supply came back into the market. So it sounds like a good solution, but it doesn't work. The only answer is more supply or less demand. Are we in a housing bubble? No. When we talk about a bubble, what that really means is prices that have become decoupled from what the value of the thing actually is. And everyone's just acting emotionally or out of fear or whatever. They've pushed prices up super high, and inevitably at some point everyone will see sense and they'll come back down again. That's not the case with housing. And don't get me wrong, there are definitely policy changes that could be made that would bring the cost of housing down. But the fact is that hasn't happened, and it's probably not going to happen, and therefore the current prices can be sustained. Now, over the last couple of years, house prices have stayed pretty much the same, and interest rates have gone up. That makes it less affordable to buy a home. So one of the things that you could have expected to happen in response to that was house prices to fall. But for various reasons, supply and demand being one of them, that hasn't happened. So what's happened instead is that mortgage lenders have started offering longer terms. So you've got longer to pay your borrowing off. And over just the last few months, we've seen lenders offering a higher multiple of your salary. So these high prices become affordable. Again, getting away from the rights and wrongs of that, and there are a lot of wrongs, it means that today's prices can be sustained. Prices have not been going up ridiculously quickly. In fact, they've been falling in inflation-adjusted terms. So whether you like where property prices are or not, you can't say it's a bubble. Why is it so hard for first-time buyers in the UK? I think it's always hard for first-time buyers. It's a big leap to make. There's never been a time in the past when it's been easy. Is it harder now? Probably yes. Harder in some parts of the country than others. But I think it's mainly because property prices are high in absolute terms. Even if you can afford the mortgage, it means that the deposit you need to have saved up is massive. And that's what's causing a real problem, in my opinion, with inequality. So you might have two people who can both afford the mortgage payments easily based on their salary, but one of them gets a deposit given to them by their parents and the other doesn't. And why does one set of parents have the money and the other doesn't? Well, it's probably because they were lucky enough to have assets, probably including property, during an asset price boom. Therefore, they're in a position to sell assets or release equity or whatever and set their children up. That, of course, means that their children in future will be able to set their children up, and you just end up with this chasm. I think it is a real problem now. It'll be more of a problem in the future, and that's why it's hard for first-time buyers. Why is stamp duty so expensive? Well, for first-time buyers, there are all kinds of schemes to reduce stamp duty. But in general, stamp duty is there because it's a tax that's really easy to collect. Every transaction gets recorded on the land registry, so you can't get around it. That doesn't mean it's a good tax. It's actually a really bad tax because it creates more friction in the housing market. What you want is for people to be able to move around for work and as their circumstances change, which actually improves productivity. Anything that jams up the housing market, which includes just how terrible the process of buying and selling a property is, but also includes stamp duty, is bad for productivity, bad for people, bad for everyone. So I don't think stamp duty is a good tax, but it's a convenient tax, and that's why it's there. Why are there so many taxes for property investors? A very good question. So it all started around 2015, which is when the way that property investors are taxed was changed significantly. And now if you own property within a company, you're taxed the same as any other company. But if you own property as an individual, you're taxed as if your mortgage cost didn't exist. So you're paying tax based on a higher profit that doesn't really exist. That's a simplification. That's kind of how it works. Well, the reason this all came in was that there was a general view among politicians that there were too many investors, they had it too easy, it needed to be discouraged somehow. So that was part of it. And you definitely could argue with this. We need more supply, so you want to be encouraging more investors, because the more people there are wanting and willing to buy houses, whoever they are, the more house builders will build. So you could say that now is the time to go easier on investors when it comes to tax. But that's extremely unlikely to happen for political reasons, because for the most part, no one's going to cry when you put up taxes for investors. That's another reason there are so many taxes for investors in the first place. But then if a government tries to remove or reduce a tax on landlords or property investors, no one's going to be happy at all. So it's not going to happen. So that's one of the reasons there are so many taxes. They're easy and popular to put in and very unpopular to take away. Will Labour make property investment impossible? No, they can't make property investment impossible. Even if they would really like to, they can't do it. And that's because, as it stands, a rental sector of around its current size is needed. And there are things you could do to reduce their reliance on the rental sector. So you could build way more social housing. So there are loads of people at the moment in receipt of housing benefit who are housed in the private rented sector who probably shouldn't be. It would be better if there were more social housing. So if you built a load of social housing, you could shrink the size of the private rented sector. If property were more affordable and more people were able to buy a home, then more people would buy. You wouldn't need such a big rented sector. You'll still need some rental properties, whatever you do, because many people, for whatever reason, are just not in a position to buy, and they might not want to buy. So I don't think the Labour government will make property investment impossible, even if, and I'm not saying they do, even if they would deep down really like to. I think that the rental reform that's going through, which we've done another video on, is not intended to make things harder. It's intended to make things better. And in some ways, it will make things better, but in many ways, it will also make things harder, either because of the way it's been implemented or unintended consequences. So I do think that in that sense, it will get harder, but I don't think that's the intention. Why is it so hard to find a place to rent? It comes back to supply and demand. There's nothing else about it. So there are debates around how many homes the country needs to add every year in order to keep up with demand. And people have different views about what that number is, but whatever number you pick, we basically never built enough to even keep up with the low end of that. So supply is becoming more scarce anyway. Also, over the last couple of years, net migration into the UK has been way higher than it was before. So again, that's more demand without there being a corresponding increase in supply. And that increase in supply may come later, but it's not there now, and that is why it's so hard to find a place to rent. Why are houses so expensive in the UK? That is a big question. It's a complicated question. And there are so many reasons. There is supply and demand, as we've talked about a few times. But another big factor, which tends not to get spoken about so much, is the ability to easily borrow and the keenness of banks to lend. So much of all the lending that's done in the economy is on property, and banks love it because it's relatively stable, it's steady, it's easy to assess the value of. And if someone stops paying, your last resort, you can always take the property back. So it's way easier than lending to businesses. And as a result of banks wanting to do it, and it being relatively easy to borrow large amounts of money, that makes property prices higher. If you withdrew all mortgage lending or you capped it so you could only borrow half of the property's value, property prices would fall dramatically. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it's true, it would happen. And that tells you that financing is a factor. And another factor is definitely political, because so many people are homeowners and so many people, a large percentage of their total net worth is tied up in their home. There's a real vested interest in keeping property prices going up because the majority of people feel happy when that happens. A lot of people don't, but the majority do. And that means if property prices are going up, it's good for the economy. People feel wealthier. People are more likely to spend. And it means that whoever's in government is more likely to get re-elected. So whenever there's a risk that prices are going to dip, the government will pull out all the stops and do whatever they can to get them going up again. Where is the best place to invest in the UK? Good. That's a much easier one. So for me, the best place to invest would be somewhere where there's lots of rental demand, where the return you can get on your money is high. In other words, you're able to charge a relatively high rent compared to the value of the property and the amount of money you're putting in, and where property prices are going to grow faster than the average. And if you go and look at the data, all of it lines up really nicely to give you one answer, which is anywhere but the south. So basically, because property prices in London and the south more broadly did so relatively well coming out of the last crash, they ended up running away from the rest of the country. So if you look at the ratio of prices in the south to prices in the north, that ratio has really increased over time. And now it's starting to reverse. The south is struggling with high prices and other areas have still got room to go up. So we do a lot of our investment in the northwest, Yorkshire, the East Midlands. Those are areas where we believe that price growth is going to be higher than average because there's room for them to go up. Whereas in the south, there isn't. And so the south will drag the average down. Obviously, that's really broad, but it's probably not helpful for me to reel off a list of 20 places. But we have done a video on our favorite investment hotspots which might be worth checking out. How can we solve the UK housing crisis? Am I allowed to pass? I don't know how we solve the UK housing crisis. Most of the problems in the UK are not specific to the UK. If you go and look at most of the major cities in the world, you'll see the same kind of pattern. You'll see that they're dealing with the same kind of issues. Obviously, some places are better off than others, but generally it's a global thing. There are actions that could be taken, but they would be so dramatic and so unpopular that I just don't see them happening. So even if we did know how to solve the housing crisis, I don't think anyone would do it because of the way incentives work and because any political party has only got a maximum of 5 years to make something happen before they're kind of put to the vote again. They're far more likely to keep on making little tweaks to try to keep the system propped up and keep it going and stop people from getting too unhappy and make it easier a little bit if they can. They're going to keep doing that rather than making any big wholesale change. I am a landlord. Should I start selling my properties? Well, it depends on you, but if you do, you should be doing it for your own reasons, not because you're panicking because you've seen headlines saying that everyone else is. So on balance, the number of landlords in the UK is roundabout constant. It may now be shrinking slightly. And you'll see lots in the press about how landlords are selling up. They're sick of all the taxes. They're worried about what the Labour government's going to do, so it's time to get out. And that absolutely is happening. But there are also a large number of people coming in and getting started in property. We see those in our business because that's the people who we tend to deal with. So they don't get talked about, but they are there. If you think about it, at any time, it's normal that some people will be becoming towards the end of their investing journey and looking to get out and liquidate, and some people will be coming in. I think it's a bit more exaggerated at the moment, but it doesn't mean that everyone's suddenly rushing for the exit. Having said that, the people who are selling now have mostly got a very good reason for doing so. So if they've been investing for 20, 30 years, they've had a great time during that time, they've had loads of capital growth. Now they're seeing things get harder. There's more regulation. Taxes are higher. Interest rates are higher than there were. So lots of those people are going, you know what, I've had a good run. Now's the time to get out. And that's a completely rational thing for them to be doing. But if you're not in that position, then it doesn't make sense to copy them, if you know what I mean. What I will say is I think property investment has got a lot harder for people who are just doing it casually. I think if you are going to be investing, you need to be doing it seriously. You need to be doing it for the long term. You need to do your research first. And you need to be doing it with a view to accumulating at least a few over time, not straight away, but over time, because there is a lot of upfront effort and learning and everything required. And for just one property, it's probably not worth it compared to any other investment you can make. But if you put all that aside and you're taking it seriously and you're going into it with a long-term view, then I think because of the fundamentals of how it works, that you borrow a fixed amount of money to buy an asset that just goes up in value over time, even if only because of inflation, and you get an income stream from that property that also goes up in line with inflation, then I think it still has the potential to be a great long-term investment. Whether it's still a great investment for you, that's for you to decide. So given all the complications I've mentioned in this video, you might be wondering, is property investing still worth it? Well, check out this video next, where I do a deep dive into that question.